The story of Roch Thériault is one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters in Canadian true crime history. To understand how a boy born in a quiet, rural town of Quebec could grow into a manipulative cult leader and brutal murderer, we must begin with his origins. His early life, upbringing, and psychological development planted the seeds of control, domination, and cruelty that would later destroy so many lives. Roch Thériault was born on May 16, 1947, in Saguenay, Quebec, Canada. He grew up in a devout Catholic household, a common setting in mid-20th century Quebec, where religion was deeply rooted in family life and community identity. His parents, Hyacinth and Pierrette, were strict and deeply religious. Like many French, Canadian families of the time, they instilled obedience, discipline, and the constant reminder of sin and salvation in their children. From an early age, Roch displayed unusual behavior. Unlike his peers, who were content with schoolwork and play, he became fascinated by the Bible, apocalyptic teachings, and theology. While other children saw religion as routine, Roch treated it as a personal obsession. His ability to memorize verses and deliver them with conviction impressed some, but also made others uneasy. He learned quickly that words, when spoken with confidence, could hold power over people. By his teenage years, Roch was intelligent but troubled. He showed signs of being highly manipulative, often bending rules and twisting situations to his advantage. He dropped out of school in the 7th grade, but was largely self-taught in subjects that fascinated him, including medicine, anatomy, and alternative healing practices. This self-education gave him an aura of knowledge that he would later exploit to control his followers. Even as a young man, Roch exhibited two contrasting sides of his personality. On one hand, he was charming, persuasive, and capable of drawing people toward him. On the other, he could be domineering, controlling, and cruel. These qualities, when combined, created the foundation for the dangerous cult leader he would eventually become. In the late 1960s, as the world was undergoing cultural upheaval, Roch was no exception to the influences of the time. He grew disillusioned with Catholicism, criticizing its rigidity and hypocrisy. He began exploring alternative belief systems, including Adventism and apocalyptic prophecies. He became convinced that the end of the world was near and that humanity was heading toward inevitable destruction. To Roch, this idea was not simply religious speculation. It was a calling. He would later use this belief to position himself as a savior figure, a man chosen to guide others through the apocalypse. Roch married young, in his early 20s, and had children, but his marriages were marked by instability, abuse, and infidelity. His partners often found him controlling and demanding, and he struggled with domestic responsibilities. He had difficulty maintaining a stable job, often drifting from one form of employment to another. But wherever he went, he carried his talent for persuasion, his obsession with religion, and his growing sense of superiority. By the early 1970s, Roch had developed a reputation for being a man with unusual charisma. He was intelligent enough to speak confidently on complex subjects, particularly health and healing, even without formal training. He adopted a fascination with holistic medicine and herbal remedies, claiming he could cure ailments without the need for traditional doctors. In small, rural Quebec communities, where access to medical professionals was limited, his claims earned him admiration and trust. People began to see him as someone gifted with knowledge beyond the ordinary. But beneath the surface of this healer's image was a dangerous desire for control. Roch was not content with simply helping people. He wanted to dominate them, to mold their beliefs, and to bend them to his will. His ability to project himself as both a spiritual leader and a healer would become the core of his cult leadership. The 1970s were a time when alternative religious movements flourished worldwide. In North America, new spiritual leaders emerged, often offering promises of salvation, healing, and freedom from the constraints of traditional society. It was during this cultural backdrop that Roch began to gather his first followers. Many of them were young men and women searching for meaning, stability, and answers in a confusing world. Roch offered them all three. He preached about the end of the world, claiming that modern society was corrupt and doomed. He told his followers that only by following him could they find salvation and be prepared for the coming apocalypse. His message resonated with those who felt lost or alienated, and as he delivered these teachings, Roch combined them with his promises of healing, herbal cures, and natural remedies. In his followers' eyes, he became not just a spiritual guide, but also a man with divine authority over life and death. At first, Roch's community looked harmless, even idealistic. He promoted vegetarianism, clean living, and a rejection of the vices of modern society, such as alcohol and tobacco. He appeared to be offering a wholesome alternative to the corruption of the outside world. But underneath these seemingly pure values, Roch's darker impulses were taking shape. His need to control, to punish, and to dominate others would soon turn his small group into a nightmare. By the late 1970s, Roch had successfully gathered a devoted following. His charm, his apocalyptic warnings, and his aura of wisdom made him appear almost prophetic. The stage was set for the creation of a commune that would become infamous worldwide. This commune would later be known as the Ant Hill Kids, a group that began as a promise of salvation and healing, but descended into an environment of terror, abuse, mutilation, and death. Chapter 1 ends with the emergence of Roch Thériault as more than just a troubled young man. He was now a leader, a self-proclaimed prophet, and a man whose charisma concealed the cruelty and violence that was yet to come. What began as a spiritual journey toward salvation was about to turn into one of the most horrific cult stories Canada had ever seen. By the late 1970s, Roch Thériault had transformed from a troubled young man into a self-proclaimed prophet. He had mastered the art of persuasion, cloaking his violent tendencies beneath a veil of religious devotion and holistic healing. It was during this period that he began gathering the followers who would eventually form his cult, one that would go down in history as one of the most brutal and horrifying groups ever documented in Canada. The beginnings of the cult were deceptively simple. Roch was deeply involved with the Seventh-day Adventist Church for a time, where he attracted attention for his charisma and passionate preaching. His ability to interpret scripture, warn of impending apocalypse, and promise salvation to those who followed him made him stand out. But he soon clashed with church leaders. He refused to follow their rigid structure, insisting that only he truly understood God's will. When he was pushed out, he took with him a handful of devoted followers who believed he was chosen by God. It was here that the roots of the Ant Hill Kids began to form. Roch told his followers that the world was coming to an end, and that only through him could they be spared from eternal damnation. He convinced them that he alone had the authority to guide them into the new world after the apocalypse. For those who were vulnerable, lonely, or searching for purpose, his words were intoxicating. They had found a savior, or so they thought. In 1977, Roch established a small community in Sainte-Marie, Quebec. He painted a picture of a simple, pure lifestyle, away from the corruption of modern society. Followers were encouraged to give up their possessions, abandon their families, and devote themselves entirely to him. He convinced them that this new life would be free of sin, free of judgment, and blessed by God. In truth, Roch was setting the stage for complete control. The commune was structured around hard labor and strict rules. Followers built cabins, farmed the land, and lived communally under Roch's supervision. He demanded absolute obedience, claiming that disobedience to him was equivalent to disobeying God. To keep them busy, he forced them into grueling tasks from sunrise to sunset, digging trenches, chopping wood, and building structures with primitive tools. From a distance, their activity resembled an army of ants working tirelessly. This is how they earned the nickname, the Ant Hill Kids. At first, life in the commune appeared idyllic. Roch encouraged vegetarian diets, natural remedies, and spiritual devotion. But very quickly, the cracks began to show. He isolated his followers from the outside world, cutting off communication with their families and forbidding contact with outsiders. The longer they stayed with him, the more dependent they became on him for guidance, food, and survival. Roch's control went beyond physical isolation. He used psychological manipulation to break down his followers' sense of self. He insisted that he was not only their leader, but their direct link to God. He alone had the right to interpret Scripture, to decide what was good and evil, and to determine their fate in the coming apocalypse. Those who doubted him were shamed, punished, or threatened with damnation. Slowly, his rules grew harsher. He forbade smoking, drinking, and most forms of pleasure. But he exempted himself from those rules. He began drinking heavily, indulging in sexual relationships with multiple women in the group, and using his position of authority to exploit them. Followers were told that intimacy with him was a divine privilege, a sacred act that brought them closer to God. For the women, refusal was unthinkable. Compliance was demanded, not requested. Over time, Roch's cruelty intensified. He claimed that physical punishment was necessary for spiritual purification. Followers who disobeyed or displeased him faced beatings, public humiliation, and forced labor. Children born into the group were not spared. They too were subjected to punishments, indoctrination, and fear. Families within the commune became secondary to the authority of Roch, who demanded to be treated as a father figure to all. The cult grew to nearly a dozen adult members and several children, most of whom were fathered by Roch himself. He believed it was his duty to populate the earth with his offspring, who would become the future of humanity after the apocalypse. His sexual domination of the women was framed as a divine mission, leaving them powerless to refuse. While Roch preached about purity and salvation, the reality of life inside the commune was harsh and terrifying. He controlled every aspect of daily living: what they ate, how they worked, when they prayed, and even who could sleep with whom. He created an environment where fear and devotion blended into a single, unbreakable bond. One of Roch's most effective tactics was alternating kindness with cruelty. At times, he would play the role of a loving father, healer, and guide, offering herbal remedies and comforting words. Other times, he would lash out violently, subjecting followers to brutal punishments. This unpredictable cycle kept them off balance and deepened their dependency. They never knew which version of Roch they would encounter, and so they clung tighter to his approval. The Ant Hill Kids became completely cut off from reality. While Roch was preaching about the end of the world, Canadian society outside the commune carried on normally. Authorities occasionally checked in on the group, but Roch's ability to charm and manipulate outsiders kept suspicion at bay. He portrayed his community as peaceful and spiritual, hiding the abuse that occurred behind closed doors. As the years passed, the commune grew darker. Roch's drinking worsened, and his punishments became increasingly sadistic. He forced followers into bizarre and degrading rituals. He demanded total loyalty, even when his commands seemed irrational or cruel. Those who questioned him were beaten, tortured, or threatened with death. The Ant Hill Kids, once portrayed as a haven from the corruption of society, had transformed into a nightmare. Behind the veneer of spirituality and simplicity, Roch had built a kingdom of fear. His followers no longer lived for themselves. They lived entirely for him. The 1980s would bring the height of Roch's reign of terror. His obsession with power, his delusions of divine authority, and his addiction to control would lead to unthinkable acts of violence. What began as a promise of salvation would descend into mutilation, torture, and murder. Chapter 2 closes on the rise of Roch Thériault's cult. He had his followers under complete control, living in isolation, obedient to his every command. But the worst was yet to come. In the years ahead, the Ant Hill Kids would witness horrors so extreme that their story remains one of the most shocking cult tragedies in history. By the early 1980s, the Ant Hill Kids were no longer a commune of hopeful seekers searching for salvation. They had become prisoners trapped in a nightmare of violence, torture, and unrelenting fear. At the center of it all was Roch Thériault, a man who had now fully embraced his role as a dictator, tormentor, and self-proclaimed prophet. The darker his behavior became, the more he demanded loyalty. his followers, cut off from the outside world and broken down psychologically, endured unimaginable horrors under his rule. Roch's descent into brutality was fueled by his growing dependence on alcohol and his insatiable need for control. He drank heavily, often to the point of rage, and used these drunken states to unleash his sadistic impulses. He justified his cruelty as divine punishment or as necessary purification. To him, every act of abuse was framed as an act of God. His followers believed, or at least, they were too afraid not to believe. The punishments he inflicted were both creative and horrifying. Followers who displeased him could be beaten with belts, hammers, or sticks. He often forced them to break their own bones or endure mutilations he performed himself. One of his most terrifying practices was self-styled surgery. Roch claimed to have healing powers and conducted medical procedures without anesthesia, proper tools, or medical knowledge. Victims were cut open with knives, burned with blowtorches, or subjected to crude amputations. These so-called operations were carried out in front of the group, both as punishment and as a demonstration of his absolute power. One of the most disturbing aspects of life inside the commune was Roch's control over childbirth and children. Many of the women bore his children, and he treated the infants as property rather than human beings. Babies were sometimes neglected, beaten, or subjected to harsh treatment from the moment they were born. In one horrifying case, a child was killed when Roch demanded extreme discipline for minor misbehavior. The lives of children in the Ant Hill Kids were marked by fear, pain, and constant danger. The adults were no safer. Roch's unpredictable moods meant that no one was ever secure. He would one day embrace a follower with affection, and the next day beat them nearly to death. He ordered members to mutilate themselves to prove their loyalty. Some had teeth pulled out, toes or fingers cut off, and skin burned. These acts served both as punishment and as a way to bind the group together through shared trauma. The deeper their suffering, the less chance they had of leaving. Among the many victims of Roch's cruelty was Solange Boillard, one of his most devoted female followers. In 1989, she experienced severe stomach pain, which Roch decided to treat. He performed one of his brutal pseudo-surgeries, cutting into her abdomen without anesthesia. The procedure caused massive internal injuries, and Solange died in excruciating pain. Instead of acknowledging her death as murder, Roch attempted to spiritualize it, insisting she would live on in divine form. He even forced other members to participate in bizarre rituals with her body. The death of Solange remains one of the most infamous crimes of the Ant Hill Kids, and a chilling example of Roch's delusions of godhood. Another follower, Gabrielle Lavallee, endured some of the most severe abuse. Over the years, Roch subjected her to countless beatings, mutilations, and forced surgeries. In one horrifying act, he amputated her arm with a dull meat cleaver. Despite this, Gabrielle remained under his control for years, illustrating the devastating psychological grip he had over his followers. Eventually, she would become one of the key survivors whose testimony helped bring him to justice. The horror inside the commune was not just physical, it was psychological. Roch manipulated his followers into believing that everything he did was for their own salvation. He used fear of damnation, threats of violence, and their isolation from the outside world to keep them under control. Many had no money, no connection to family, and no hope of survival outside the group. Leaving meant abandoning the only community they knew and risking Roch's wrath. Despite the extreme abuse, authorities were slow to intervene. The commune was isolated, hidden away in rural areas of Quebec and later Ontario. When concerned outsiders raised questions, Roch often managed to deflect suspicion with his charisma. He painted the commune as a simple, spiritual community misunderstood by outsiders. And because many followers were too afraid to speak out, the full extent of his crimes remained hidden for years. By the late 1980s, however, the atrocities could no longer be ignored. Reports of abuse began to surface, largely due to survivors who found the courage to escape. They described not just physical beatings, but acts of mutilation and murder. These revelations painted a horrifying picture of life under Roch Thériault, one that shocked even seasoned investigators. The Ant Hill kids had gone from a hopeful religious commune to a house of horrors. What began as a vision of purity and salvation had descended into a nightmare of torture and death. Roch had become not just a cult leader, but a sadistic killer who used faith as a weapon to control and destroy lives. By 1989, the walls of Roch's kingdom of terror were beginning to close in. Survivors were stepping forward, and law enforcement was finally ready to act. The shocking details of his crimes would soon be laid bare in court, and Roch would face justice for the horrors he inflicted. But the legacy of his brutality, the scars left on his followers, the lives lost, and the children who grew up in terror, would remain long after his cult collapsed. Chapter 3 ends with the commune at its darkest point. Roch had crossed every line: imaginable mutilation, child abuse, sexual domination, and murder. Yet, in his mind, he was still the prophet, the chosen one, the man of God preparing his people for the end of days. What awaited him, however, was not divine glory but arrest, trial, and ultimately a violent end behind prison walls. By 1989, the dark reign of Roch Thériault and his Ant Hill kids was finally unraveling. For over a decade, he had manipulated, abused, mutilated, and murdered within the secrecy of his isolated commune. But the walls of silence began to break, thanks to the courage of survivors who had endured unimaginable suffering. Their voices would ultimately bring an end to Roch's twisted kingdom of terror. The downfall of Roch Thériault began with the escape of Gabriel Lavallee, one of his most loyal but severely abused followers. After years of torture, including the amputation of her arm at Roch's hands, Gabrielle managed to flee the commune. Gravely injured and traumatized, she sought help from the authorities. When she revealed the horrors she had endured, investigators were stunned. Her testimony was detailed, consistent, and filled with disturbing accounts of torture, mutilation, and even murder. Law enforcement quickly realized that what they were dealing with was not just an abusive commune, but a house of horrors. They launched a full investigation, uncovering evidence of widespread abuse, physical violence, and the death of followers, most notably Solange Boilard. Survivors began to come forward, describing beatings, forced surgeries, sexual exploitation, and years of psychological torment. Each testimony painted the same chilling picture. Roch Thériault was not a healer or a prophet. He was a sadistic tyrant. In 1989, police raided the commune and arrested Roch. For many of his followers, the nightmare was finally over, though the scars, both physical and emotional, would last a lifetime. Children were taken into protective custody, and survivors began the long process of recovery. For the first time in over a decade, they were free. The trial that followed was one of the most shocking in Canadian history. Prosecutors laid out a case that exposed the full extent of Roch's brutality. They presented evidence of mutilations, forced amputations, sexual abuse, child abuse, and the murder of Solange Boilard. Witness after witness described the terror they lived under and the horrors they endured. Gabrielle's testimony was especially powerful. She recounted in harrowing detail how Roch had butchered her body, leaving her permanently disfigured. Roch, however, showed little remorse. In court, he often appeared defiant, portraying himself as a misunderstood spiritual leader. He claimed that his actions were part of a divine plan, even suggesting that his followers consented to the punishments he inflicted. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through his delusions of grandeur. In 1993, Roch Thériault was convicted of second-degree murder for the death of Solange Boilard and of multiple counts of aggravated assault related to his horrific abuse of other followers. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 25 years. For the survivors, the verdict brought a sense of justice, though it could never erase the years of suffering they endured. Inside prison, Roch remained a deeply disturbing figure. Even behind bars, he attempted to exert influence over others. He wrote letters, tried to justify his actions, and continued to see himself as a prophet. Some accounts suggest that he attempted to gather new followers even while incarcerated, reaching out through correspondence to those who might be susceptible to his manipulations. His ego and delusions never faded, even as his power was stripped away. Prison life for Roch was not easy. Inmates who commit crimes against women and children are often targeted, and Roch's reputation preceded him. Many prisoners despised him for his brutality and sadism. He lived under constant threat, and his domineering personality did little to win him allies. Over the years, he became an isolated figure, hated both inside and outside the prison walls. By 2011, Roch was serving his sentence at the Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick, a maximum security prison. At 63 years old, he remained unrepentant, still clinging to his identity as a prophet. But on February 26, 2011, his life came to a violent end. That day, Roch was found dead in his cell, the victim of a brutal beating. His cellmate, Matthew MacDonald, a convicted murderer, confessed to killing him. Reports indicated that MacDonald stabbed Roch and then turned himself in, telling guards, "That piece of shit is down on the range. Get him out of here." For many, Roch's death felt like a grim form of justice. He had lived by violence and control, and he died by violence at the hands of another inmate. The news of his death spread quickly across Canada and beyond. For survivors, it was the final chapter of a nightmare. Roch Thériault could no longer hurt anyone, but the scars he left behind, physical mutilations, broken families, and deep psychological trauma, remained as reminders of his reign of terror. The legacy of Roch Thériault is one of cruelty and manipulation. He turned religion into a weapon, exploiting faith to justify his sadism. He destroyed lives under the guise of salvation, proving how dangerous unchecked charisma and authority can be when combined with delusion and violence. His cult, the Ant Hill Kids, will forever stand as a warning of the destructive power of manipulation, fear, and blind devotion. Today, the story of Roch Thériault continues to be studied by psychologists, criminologists, and historians as a case of extreme cult abuse. His crimes highlight the dangers of isolation, the vulnerability of those searching for meaning, and the devastating impact of unchecked power. Survivors of his cult remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to endure even the darkest of circumstances and eventually find freedom. Roch's life ended violently, just as he had lived violently. But for those who study his crimes, his death is not the conclusion. It is a reminder of the importance of vigilance, of questioning authority, of protecting the vulnerable, and of ensuring that figures like Roch Thériault never again gain the power to destroy so many lives. And so, the story of Roch Thériault closes not with redemption, but with a warning about the dangers of blind faith, the fragility of human trust, and the monstrous cruelty that can grow when one man is given unchecked control over the lives of others.